Hello again, Harlem Renaissance students. I'm here with another installment of some commentary on Their Eyes Were Watching God. This time chapters 6 through 9. And I want to point out a few ways that we see some other motifs and themes come up in these chapters and ways we see Janie grow and develop. The main things I'm going to talk about here are issues of folklore and folk traditions, especially speech traditions involving ways of playing around with words and storytelling. I'll also point out another few ways that animal imagery is again quite important. And this other motif that becomes more prominent in these chapters of the difference between an inner life and an outer life. These sort of comments on inside and outside that come up a few times. So I'm just going to go through, and again, I'll be referring to my copy of the book and reading a few short passages and pointing out some details. One of the first things is, of course, at the beginning of chapter 6, there's this long section on the business of Matt Bonner's mule. And there's a few things that are important there. One is the townspeople really enjoy telling stories about this mule, telling stories about how badly Matt Bonner has mistreated it. And Janie really enjoys hearing those stories and thinks it's kind of a fun way of playing. Sometimes she'd like to hear more about it and play more, but Joe always tells her to go inside the store and wait on customers. But Janie does not enjoy when they actually start being cruel to the mule, when they're trying to catch the mule and the mule's all out of breath. And at that point, then, she sort of tells them to stop and gets upset. And on page 57, and I think the pagination is the same in various copies of the book. So for me, it's page 57, a few pages into chapter 6. She goes inside and is upset when the townspeople are chasing the mule and being physically cruel to it. And we see the statement, a little war of defense for helpless things was going on inside of her. So keep in mind here, of course, that way back in chapter 2, when Janie's grandmother was explaining to her why she really wanted to sort of force her to marry Logan Killicks, Janie's grandmother says the black woman is the mule of the world. And of course, Janie does feel helpless at this point in the power position she's in with Joe. So Janie very much identifies with the mule and is critical of the townspeople for being cruel to it. So that's when Joe steps in to make this big, grand gesture of buying the mule. And I did want to make one comment about how Joe speaks. A couple of you have mentioned that it is a little tricky to follow the dialogue because it's spelled phonetically and you have to kind of maybe say it out loud and picture what they're saying. And Joe is always using this expression, I God. And it's spelled with a capital I, like we use when we say I, but it's really kind of meant to express a particular way of pronouncing just an exclamation like, my God, like, oh my God, Janie. But he says it, I God, Janie, this, I God, that. But of course, Hurston does that as a way to also emphasize that, of course, Joe kind of thinks of himself as a god. He's very full of himself. So one thing about Joe there, and here's one of his godlike gestures. He buys the mule to sort of appease Janie, but also to have one more thing to brag about. And then all the stories and jokes continue, and Janie does enjoy hearing those. They keep making jokes about the mischief the mule gets into now that he just gets to get fat and be lazy. And then, of course, when the mule dies, Joe also uses that as an opportunity to make a big show of how he's going to have a big ceremony about this mule. And one other thing, even before the mule dies, I wanted to point out on page 58, right after Joe buys the mule, that's one of the first times we see Janie get to speak in front of a group of people, and she really praises Joe for what a wonderful thing he's done, as though he's Lincoln freeing the slaves, and the townspeople are so impressed with how she speaks. So we see here more evidence that Janie would enjoy taking part of these games, these talking games, and she is not able to because Joe doesn't let her. But he lets her that one time because it's all about praising him. So then the mule dies, and we see again, Joe makes a big show of it, makes a big game of it, but he doesn't let Janie go to the sort of dragging out ceremony, the funeral for the mule. So it's another way he keeps her down and doesn't allow her to do that. And near the end of that episode about the mule, we see once the mule carcass is dragged out of town, these buzzards that have been circling come down, and then the buzzards have their own special little ceremony. So that odd little bit there on pages 61 and 62, where all of a sudden we see some of these buzzards have names. One of them is named Parson, and he's apparently the most important one, the big shot one. And the other buzzards have to wait until he comes down and says something before they start eating the carcass. And they go through this little ritualistic call and response sort of ceremony over the carcass. All these buzzards talking. So that's a little bit of writing that would be referred to as magical realism. So the context of the whole book is realistic settings, but just all of a sudden there's this little story about these talking buzzards. So that's magical, but it's in the midst of realistic fiction. And it's referred to as magical realism. And it is also, I really hope my text notification doesn't show up on the screen there. I apologize if it did. But that bit where the buzzards are having the funeral is one more way Hurston's sort of poking fun at Joe Starks, because that buzzard Parson is a lot like Joe Starks there. So the buzzards have their funeral, life keeps going on. And then also in chapter 6, we have some long bits of more of this play with debates and philosophical debates and folklore stories about the man that can eat people and the play courtship. And that's all part of these folk traditions. I would also point out again on page 63, shortly after the mule dies, we see one of these examples of an inner life versus an outer life, where we see Janie's had an argument with Joe, and she says she didn't change her mind, but she agreed with her mouth. Her heart said, even so, but you don't have to cry about it. So that's one example of a number of places we see a distinction made between what's going on inside Janie or outside Janie. So again, chapter 6, much of the rest of it is word play, storytelling, play courtship. And just keep in mind, for one thing, Zora Neale Hurston was a folklorist, an ethnographer. She had traveled all around Florida collecting folk stories. This is part of what she did and what she studied. So she incorporates a lot of that tradition here. Also keep in mind that in this time and place, that's their entertainment. That's how they build community, and that's how they just have fun. It's like their Netflix of the day. So that's what they're doing to entertain themselves. And it also relates to these themes of the Harlem Renaissance. How do shared stories build a sense of identity, connection to a particular community? And how does the way people interact about those stories sometimes bring a little bit of division, like who gets to speak and who doesn't, and who wins at these storytelling games? All right. I want to skip ahead. Like I said, I'm going to sort of be flipping through pages of my book for some important elements. So, again, on page 71, we see another argument between Janie and Joe. And at this point, he's telling her what she should be doing. And he says, I need to be telling you what to do. You can't tell yourself what to do. Somebody's got to think for women and children and chickens and cows. God, they sure don't think none themselves, Joe says. So again, women particularly compared to animal. Just below that, we see this statement, times and scenes like that put Janie to thinking about the inside state of her marriage. Time came when she fought back with her tongue as best she could, but it didn't do her any good. It just made Joe do more. The spirit of the marriage left the bedroom and took to living in the parlor. It was there to shake hands whenever company came to visit, but it never went back inside the bedroom again. So again, this inside out. There's an interior life and an exterior life, and they don't always match up. And then a bit later on page 71, she wasn't petal open with him anymore. So that goes back to that motif of the tree. And trees and plants are important all throughout again. Then, and remember also at that point, Nanny had referred to her life as a cracked plate. And so we have these domestic images too of what's in certain rooms of the house. On page 72, Janie stood where he left her for unmeasured time and thought. She stood there until something fell off the shelf inside of her. So it kind of reminisces back to that cracked plate of Nanny's. She went inside there to see what it was. It was her image of Jody tumbled down. So she realizes she had put Jody on a pedestal and he was never going to be what she hoped he would. She had no more blossomy openings dusting pollen over her man, neither any glistening young fruit where the petals used to be. So again, the tree imagery tells us that as well. She bathed and put on a fresh dress and head kerchief and went on to the store before Jody had time to send for her. That was about to the outside of things. So she really starts to think of her life as inside and outside from this point on. I'm going to go on to now chapter 7. We've jumped forward in time. Janie's been living this sort of inside outside split life with Joe for quite a while at this point, and this is after Joe has hit her a couple of times, at least that we're told about. And chapter 7 is, we're told again that she's just the shadow of herself. She's not really who she is. We're told, in fact, she received all things with the stolidness of the earth, which soaks up urine and perfume with the same indifference. She's just indifferent about things. She's again compared to an animal early in chapter 7. You ain't no young pullet no more. Joe is mocking her appearance. And here she does start to stand up to him more and more. And chapter 7 is this point where she gives him this harsh insult. After he has insulted her looks again for the millionth time, she says, "You talk about me looking old. When you pull down your britches, you look like the change of life." And that's really a turning point for Joe, and that's when he even starts to physically get more and more sick. That's also the point when Sam Watson says, "Oh, you all are really playing the dozens tonight." So it's another place where the folklore, verbal traditions of storytelling and the dozens, some of you are probably very familiar with the dozens, but if you're not, that's a name for a sort of game of ritual insult that is common in certain parts of the Black community. Often, it would escalate to a point of somebody saying something about someone else's mother. Your mom is so black, your mom is so fat, your mom is so lazy. It would be these insults towards the mother that are done as part of the game, but usually the insults towards the mother are as far as it can go. That's about the worst. However, Janie insulting what he looks like when he pulls his pants down, that's pretty rough. And I've asked a question on the forum of, what do you think about that? Is it too much? Does he deserve it? And Joe's pretty hurt by it. Chapter 8, we see his physical decline, and we see that the townspeople, again, with their gossip, start talking as though maybe she's poisoned him or maybe she's put a spell on him. Janie, in fact, wants an actual medical doctor to come and visit Joe, and he won't allow that. He's instead listening to someone who's trying to sort of peddle these folk remedies, and maybe a witch doctor, someone like that. And Janie wishes he would just let an actual doctor come, which doesn't happen until it's too late. We see again, she does finally get the chance to go in and talk with him when he's near his death. And she has a little bit of pity for him after he dies. And one of the very first things she does after he dies is takes off her handkerchief and lets her hair come down. So we see the importance of the hair imagery again. She does tie it back up to go on with her life in the store. And chapter 9 again, as we see her adjustment after the funeral. The hair is important. It's a representation of maybe her greater sense of freedom. We see again the inside versus outside imagery on page 89, the second page of chapter 9. We see that she's sort of digging around inside of herself and finding that she has no interest in that seldom seen mother. She doesn't care what happened to her mother, and she discovers she hated her grandmother. I asked a question about that on the forum as well. Let's see. And again, there's another motif that comes up a number of times in the book is the importance of roads and of the horizon. And the reference to the horizon is one of the ways Janie thinks about why she is so angry at her grandmother for what she did. More in chapter 9 about her looking inside of herself a little bit more. And we see again some references to her conversations with Phoebe, the close friend that we saw her come back to at the very beginning of the novel. So those are just a few details, examples of some motifs and some themes to be keeping an eye out for in these chapters. Maybe a little explanation of some of the more odd things. Again, if you have any questions about any of the chapters or things you're reading, please do email me. And let me know, again, if the video is useful. This is the third one. I'd be happy to keep doing these. And I will be seeing you around on Moodle. I hope you all are well.